Hey, thanks for joining us today. I am Pastor David, and if you don't know me, if you haven't been involved with the church, I do the youth. I take care of the youth in all of our services. I also have a background in biblical languages. I got my master's degree from the Pentecostal Theological Seminary, specifically in biblical languages. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start a series on the biblical names of God coming from a language perspective. And in order to do that, we're going to look at an interlinear. An interlinear Bible is basically just a depiction of the original Hebrew or Greek, and then it gives you some additional information. I have some on the screen that we have prepared. This is actually Genesis 1:1, and you'll see that it has the Hebrew. In fact, this is exactly how it would show up in the scripture itself, in the Hebrew scripture. It has the Hebrew written out, and then it gives you some additional information. It gives you the English translation of each word as we go through. It gives its part of speech, whether it's a preposition, a noun, a verb. Down here it gives its pronunciation, and then up at the very top you'll have the Strong's Concordance number. Strong's, when they went through the Hebrew and the Greek, they assigned a number to every single word, so that when you look at this, you can pull that up in Strong's, and then other people latched onto it, like Brown Driver Briggs. He makes a lot of dictionaries and things, or he made a lot of dictionaries and stuff like that in regards to Hebrew and Greek. And so the numbers at the top just kind of give us a way to go back and forth between a bunch of different reference materials to find out more about the different names and the different words that are used in Scripture. Now, when we talk about the names of God, the best place I think to start is the beginning, and I kind of want to take this from the beginning and move through and do them in order, so that we're not looking at one name and then trying to figure out how that name came into use, or the significance of that, especially when you're looking at languages. Languages tend to build on themselves. So if we start at the beginning, we can look at how people referred to God initially and how that evolved through time. And there will be a lot of building on. So some of the names that we use will be used later in addition to other names in reference to God. So I want to kind of build this at the bottom. And the only way to do that really is from Genesis 1:1, which is the first indication of a name or a title given to God. Now if we look at Genesis 1:1, it actually starts off right here at the beginning. It says Bereshit. Now Bereshit means in the beginning. And if we go on from there, that's his prepositional phrase. In fact, it'll start right there and say prepositional phrase. It's also written in the singular. And then it goes on from there, and we have our verb, bara, created. Now the verb doesn't start the same as, or isn't used the same as it is in the English language. If we go through the English language and we were to write this same passage, we would have in the beginning, and we put a comma because that's our prepositional phrase introducing us, and then we would say God created. And this is pretty typical of almost every way that we use nouns and verbs in English. We always start with the subject and go to the verb. You guys didn't realize you're going to get an English lesson, but it kind of helps to understand the difference between Hebrew and English if we know where we're starting at and what we're looking at. So, God becomes the subject, created is the verb. God is the one doing the creating. Now, when we look at Hebrew, if we were to read it and translate it the exact same way that it is, it would say, in the beginning, created God. Now, in English, we would look at that and we'd say, okay, so who created God? Completely different use of verbs and nouns in Hebrew. In Hebrew, your verb always precedes the noun. So, in this instance, we have created. Well, who did the creating? God. And then over here, we have our direct object. If we look back at the way we write it, He created the heavens and the earth. And this would be our direct object. Now, a couple of things to note, especially when we look at our use of God and the verb. In some ways, Hebrew is more similar to Spanish or other European languages, Eastern European more specifically, than English, because in English we have our verb is the same no matter what. It's always created. If we wanted to say that a woman created something, we would say she created. If we said a man, he created. Somebody or specifically, David created, or John created a table, for instance. The verb never changes. In Hebrew, it's completely different. The verb carries tense. It also carries masculine or feminine, and it can also be written singular or plural. So, God created in Hebrew would look different than they created, because one would use a singular verb, the other would use a plural verb. If we look at this scripture, in fact it shows us right now that this is the call perfect. Now that's the type of verb right there, and that's the tense. And then it says right there, it's third masculine singular. So it uses a third masculine singular, which would be like he created. Speaking of somebody else in the third person in the singular form. Now the interesting thing is, if you look at Elohim, which is our first name for God that we see, the first name for God, of course, is a noun, but it is in the masculine plural. Now, in Hebrew, both of these should have been in the same tense. They should have had the same, I'm trying to think of what the verbiage I would use in regards to this, because they would both be either masculine or plural, masculine or feminine, and then they would both be singular or plural, not both. But one thing that we notice in Hebrew is that every single time the scriptures use the term Elohim in reference to God, it uses the plural form, Elohim, and then it will use singular verbiage, saying He is. So we have this juxtaposition of singular and plural. And that's something that we see a lot in reference to God. A lot of theologians have pointed to that as an indication of the Trinity at work, even from the beginning, that there's a plurality to God, but yet a singularity as well. To us, this makes a lot of sense as Christians that believe in the Holy Trinity, one God in three parts. If you look throughout the rest of Scripture, there's really some great teachings in regards to this. There's really a lot of Scripture that you can pull to. There are instances where God refers to himself in the third person plural, and then does something in the singular. I can give you a quick, easy example. When God says, "Let us make man," he refers to himself in the plural, "let us." And then some people look at that scripture and they're kind of like, why does he use us? But it's an instance of God using the plural in reference to himself and yet also the singular, so that they are both the same. Now, we have not only that singular and plural going on, but we also have this name. And going back to the name, on every single one of these, you're going to have, in fact, you can see it right here, you're going to have endings. So when it says Elohim, God, Ha-Shamayim, heavens, the heavens, in fact, that's a precursor to Shema, which is heaven. And that right there is your plural, and that right there is your plural. Now, some people look at Elohim and they see instances where the scriptures use El instead of Elohim, and they'll sit there and say things like, well, El is the singular. That's actually not true. It's a shortened form. You see the same thing when we get into some of the other names, specifically our next lesson when we get into the covenant name of God, which is always shortened and never spoken in its entirety. But when they would use El, they're actually using the very beginning of it and shortening that name. It becomes kind of similar to people who call me Dave instead of David. Now, personally, I don't like that. So if you call me Dave, I might not answer. But luckily for us, regardless of what we call God, when we cry out to him, he listens. When we're looking at this, though, the name Elohim is really interesting because Elohim is the first reference we have to God. And it quite literally means God. There's not really a whole lot to add to that. The interesting thing, in fact, I'm going to clear this so we can get into it a little bit more. The interesting thing about it is it tends to be a bit of a generic name. And I'm going to even put that here because this generic name for God, Elohim, is the only name for God that is used in several different instances for several different people in regards to different people. When it talks about Balaam, it says that he is a false Elohim. When it refers, in fact, there's a psalm that the scriptures say that we are Elohim because we are sons of the Most High Elohim. Which, I mean, that's kind of a little bit of shock and awe when you start thinking about that God even referred to us using this generic form, but not that he was calling us God on his level, but it was that he was calling us his sons. He was making that delineation, something that a lot of Israelites later on, especially during the advent of Christ, the Israelites, when they would hear people referred to as the sons of God, they would get up in arms about it. How can you be the son of God? You are a human. They kept that delineation, but if you look, God has always had us in close proximity. If you even look in Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 4, I believe it's 4, you have the genealogies of Adam and the genealogies of Cain. Now why this is significant is because Adam, God created. He formed Adam out of the dust of the earth. He breathed into him the breath of life. And the scripture says that Adam, or man, became a living soul. So Adam was of God, and he had two sons that we all know the story. Most of us do. If you're listening to this, you probably do. Of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were the two sons of Adam. And Cain got upset because Abel's sacrifice to God was accepted and his wasn't. So Cain killed Abel. At that point, we have a split in the human race. And two genealogies are given. This is the significance a lot of people don't see in reference to genealogies. A lot of us look at them and go, oh, well, why did they even put that in there? Because it's significant. The genealogies, especially in this instance, demonstrate a split within the human race. Because Adam was of the godly line, and Cain, because he sinned, and because he was under the curse of killing his brother, became the ungodly line. So you've got godly and ungodly. If you look in Genesis when it gives their genealogy, the scripture will say that God created Adam in his own image. And then Adam bore a son in his own image, Seth. And it starts Adam's genealogy with God. But on Cain's genealogy, it doesn't start with God. In fact, it doesn't even start with Adam. It actually starts with Cain. It says Cain had a son and called his name. So we see this connection between the godly line and the ungodly line, where one was seen as delineating from God and one delineating of himself because of his rejection of who God was. Now, going back to the name and how the scriptures demonstrated that we were God's, that we were of God, issuing out from God. It demonstrates our connection to God. It demonstrates who we were. But at this point, what we have is just this generic moniker. And it's interesting that throughout Genesis, the entire first chapter, this is the only reference we have to God. God created. God said. God did this. On the seventh day, God rested. It's all that term, Elohim, that if we were to transliterate into English, it would look like this. So, every reference to God in the first chapter, before we see any interaction with man, before we see any interaction with anything else, is Elohim. So if you look at it, before there was Elohim. And there was this separation because he was all there was. In fact, this word, and I kind of skipped over it at the beginning, this word in the beginning can sometimes be translated at the first. The significance is that in this whole process, God literally created time. There was not a before. This was the beginning. God formed time, and the scriptures demonstrate that throughout the first chapter of Genesis by showing that he made the sun, the moon, that he made the seasons, that he made everything, and when he fashioned it, he made the morning and the evening, and that was the first day ever, not the first day of the week. It was the first day ever. There was no time before God existed. God always was. That's one reason that there was no beginning to God, because he always was. This is the beginning, when God created it. Now, when we get into this created, I want to go kind of back into it as well. We have what's known as the perfect tense. This perfect tense that we were looking at right here is slightly different than what we would think of. We have in English, we have a past tense and a present tense. We have a future tense. So, if we were going to say, Jane threw the ball, we can say it a few different ways. We can say, Jane is going to throw the ball, future tense. Jane threw the ball, past tense. Or Jane is throwing the ball, present tense. Now, perfect tense is different because in Hebrew, there's basically two main tenses. And it doesn't have to do with past, present, or future. It has to do with completion. Now, the imperfect tense is one, and that demonstrates something that is in the process. This is not yet completed. That is something that we are working towards. That if I was to say throw and use the verb throw, me throwing something, being in the process, would be imperfect. Now the perfect tense, that's not a P. The perfect tense is completion. Now, that's interesting because it's not just a past tense in that it's done. It's that it was started, is in the process, and is completed. It almost encompasses all of it. So you could say, in this instance, that God created, past tense, is creating, and will create the heavens and the earth. That God is consistently working in every aspect of it. And so when we get to this generic name, it makes you wonder, who is this person that's before time? Who is this person that is intimately involved in creation, so much so that he's involved in every aspect of it continually, not only past but present and future, in this continuous creation? Who is this God that we have just this name Elohim? This name that quite honestly is used throughout Scripture in reference to a whole ton of people, a whole slew of people. Every false deity that you can think of that's demonstrated in the Scriptures is referred to as an Elohim. Baal is a false Elohim. Dagon is a false Elohim. And its significance is that at this point, there were no other gods. Now, I don't want to think that we're pulling into pantheism, because we're not. We don't believe that. There were no other gods. There were no other things called God. There were no other things that could even be compared. There was only Elohim, the God who created the heavens and the earth. In fact, some instances you'll see them refer to the Creator of heaven and earth. And a lot of other cultures, they will actually refer to the Creator God. I think that's interesting. People who have never had any interaction with Christianity will actually refer to the Creator God. So when we have this generic name that at this point only speaks specifically to the God that we know, and then as other people start worshiping fake idols and fake ideals, fake things that they have fashioned with their own hand, when they start worshiping those things, they start calling those things God. So it was really a name that was taken and misused. It was a name that was only used in reference to God until other people started manufacturing gods. And so they would start referring to them using that same noun, that same word. And it kind of makes me wonder how God really looked at that. If you think about it, God comes on the scene and he basically introduces himself and says, look, I'm God. And then all these other people start going out and they start thinking of all these other things, conjuring all these other depictions. And they start going, you know what? This is God. You know what? This over here is God. It'd be like somebody trying to steal my identity. You know, if somebody started going around saying, well, I'm David Shepard, and this other person starts going, well, I'm David Shepard. They start trying to take that identity. And sometimes we look at the God of the Old Testament that we kind of separate from the New Testament as if they're different, even though they are the same. We see this Old Testament depiction of God getting really irate when other people bow down to something made out of stone and call it God. But I think that that's one reason that God, in his infinite wisdom, started out with a generic reference. See, this isn't the name of God. This isn't an intimate, connective name for God. This is more of a descriptor. This is more of he is the divine. He is God. So ultimately, everybody else that claims that name is a pretender to the throne. So much so that God even diminishes his own name. I'm sorry, let me back up. That sounds horrible. He didn't diminish his own name. What he did was he took that name that was used in reference to him, that generic form, and then he used that to connect us to him. And then he said in the Psalms, I say that you are Elohim because you are sons of the Most High. So he basically took a generic term that had been removed from Judaism and used by other cultures and even used by other Jewish individuals in reference to false deities. He took that and he repurposed it. And he said, you're talking about all these other people, but I'm going to tell you something. Your connection to me is that I am your Father. I am the Most High God, and I am making you my son and my daughter. It's awe-inspiring that he brings us into that relationship, that later we would see Jesus say that we are heirs and joint heirs with Christ, and that if we will continue on in this path, one day we will be like him because we will see God for who he truly is. And as great as this generic name, as great as it is, it's not God. It's simply pointing towards who God is. And next time we're going to look at, and I think you're going to see, that He has so much more in store. This is almost like a shadow of things to come. He's basically creating everything and saying, this is kind of a shadow of who I am. I am God. But I will bring you in and show you who I truly am. And we'll get into that next time.